Hello, this is Christian, and welcome to Dark Portents. Sorry that so many of these videos have been of the guy rambling in his car variety, but I have not had a lot of good times to record at home, but soon we will get some videos where I'm not a guy rambling in his car. For today, I wanted to talk about what is Grimdark, the stereotypes versus what's in the fiction. Now, if you ask this question in a lot of fantasy communities, Grimdark communities, sci-fi communities, there's no real agreement on the parameters of the subgenre. Everybody has their own definitions. They often clash with each other, and even among authors, among readers of Grimdark, among haters of the subgenre, there's no real agreement. There's kind of an I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it mentality. So, I'm obviously going to put forward my own opinion on the subject and sort of talk about the way that Grimdark is often stereotyped by people who are not a fan of the subgenre, and feel free to comment in the comment section and tell me why I'm completely wrong. So, before I did this video, I asked a bunch of Grimdark authors and readers in a group that I'm in online what misconceptions or preconceptions about the subgenre that they found most unhelpful or inaccurate, but kept running into them again and again. And these are some of the answers that I got. One person said, "I don't like what Grimdark has to say about human nature." These are all them quoting the stereotypes. "I just don't think it's realistic." Another one said that a common stereotype is Grimdark is one note. It's simply bad people in cycles of nihilistic sadism with no uplifting moments, drama, growth, or depth. Yet another comment: there is never an upbeat moment or humor. Another one, which I will definitely address, is it's just torture porn. Another is all it is graphic violence and sexual violence, with the characters being doomed from the start, and there are no happy endings. And finally, that Grimdark authors are just being edgy. Now, if I missed any common misconceptions or preconceptions that you particularly find unhelpful or inaccurate, feel free to tell me in the comments sections. But these are the ones that we came up with. So, are these stereotypes accurate? And what's in the fiction? I'm going to go into some common themes that you'll find in a lot of Grimdark. Now, of course, not every Grimdark novel will have all of these themes in them, and some novels that are not in any way Grimdark or Grimdark adjacent will have some of these themes. But I think broadly speaking, you'll find that a lot of these themes run as a through line through things most people agree fit into the subgenre. So one of these users that I quoted above said, "The misconception about it being all about the violence for violence's sake annoys me. It's about human decisions and consequences, and learning to live with the aftermath." I particularly like that way of putting it. A lot of what you see in good Grimdark is moral complexity being represented and moral relativism being represented. There's not a guarantee from some sort of authorial authority or Gandalf type figure, usually, that the actions of the characters you're following are necessarily moral actions, or that they're justifiable, and you don't always know who you should root for. The author in Grimdark often doesn't tell you who you're supposed to be rooting for or against. Although sometimes, rather than going with a totally morally gray, like multiple cast of characters, you don't know who's right and who's wrong kind of approach, like Joe Abercrombie often does, sometimes this is instead they use like the Grimdark anti-hero although the two things can be blended, and Abercrombie often does blend these two concepts, but sometimes you have a protagonist or several protagonists in a grimdark that are basically good guys, that are basically bad guys and doing a lot of bad things, but they're doing them for like the right reason, to like, protect the people they love, or to protect the city they grew up in, or because the villain or antagonist is doing things that are that make whatever bad things that the anti-hero is doing seem necessary to them. Though even in those cases, like the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang I'm probably mispronouncing her name, is a great example of this, where you see the crimes that the main character's enemies commit, and you see the atrocities that they commit, and you see from her perspective how what she does might seem necessary to her, but the author does not give all of her actions authority as moral, and it's up to the reader to decide, was that really necessary? Do those ends really justify those means? And it calls the moral certainty that you often find in more heroic fantasy into question a lot more than you would get in heroic fantasy. Now, of course, there are plenty of authors that aren't grimdark that use moral complexity and moral relativism and moral uncertainty as themes in their work. You have Malazan by Stephen Erickson, which certainly wouldn't qualify as grimdark. You have Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, which has a lot of moral relativism in it, and usually even the most cartoonishly evil characters in Brandon Sanderson's work see themselves as doing what they think is necessary, and that their ends justify their means, and like every character is the protagonist in their own story kind of thing, even though that's not grimdark. But it is a common theme in grimdark, and grimdark makes a point of having this kind of like moral complexity, this moral relativism, of not letting the reader be comfortable knowing ahead of time that they can always root for the actions of the characters that they love. Another question that was raised earlier in the video is grimdark one note, lacking any upbeat moments or humor? And I think that people who think that have either never read grimdark, or they've read like some of the most like edgy and dark and nihilistic grimdark out there. Not all grimdark is like that. Some of the bleakest and darkest grimdark novels I've read, like the Poppy War, have moments of levity, have upbeat moments, have moments of hope, have character growth and personal growth. But aside from the Poppy War, look at Joe Abercrombie's First Law world. I mean, First Law is considered to be, one of the like epitomes of what it is to write grimdark fantasy. And there is a lot of levity. Those books are hilarious. Yeah, they'll move me to tears, or they'll make me feel horrible at some parts, but a great majority of the time I am laughing at those books. And I think that there's so much room to explore character growth, to explore humor, to explore all kinds of things that people complain that grimdark doesn't deal with within the grimdark subgenre. So I just don't think that holds up really. Another example would be Peter McLean's War for the Rose Throne, which the first book is Priest of Bones. Those books are hilarious. One thing that grimdark deals with that makes me think that people who think it's just all bleak and all one note aren't grappling with seriously is that rather than the idea that like everything is hopeless and there's no point to anything, and everything is bleakness and darkness, and that there's no such thing as redemption, what a lot of grimdark does is it shows redemption in ways that more heroic fantasy and fiction doesn't show. Like, rather than having a character like Darth Vader where there's a redemptive moment at the end, and it's kind of like an epiphany, and the character is redeemed sort of in a permanent sense, and then he passes away and it's over, and he got redemption in the end. Grimdark shows people that have that have bad habits, that have patterns of behavior like addiction or problems with violence or problems with money or whatever the case may be, where they do try to work on it, and they might experience personal growth, and they might try to move on and no longer be a person of violence. But like in the real world, it also shows a lot of pressures on these individuals that make it feel that create room for excuses or remove room for avoiding the behaviors that they're trying to grow out of, and that pressure them to rationalize backsliding into their old habits and into their problems, and sometimes being even worse than when they started to try to redeem themselves. And I think that that's just a realistic depiction of how some people deal with persistent bad habits. I mean, we've all met people like this, I assume, that struggle, and there's not just one redemptive moment, but there's a process, a back and forth, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, where redemption comes through struggle, and where the world pushes back against the redemption. And I've got this quote here from William Faulkner that a lot of people attribute to George R.R. Martin, because George R.R. Martin quotes this quite a bit, and it's that the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And I think that is one of the central themes of grimdark fantasy, and that it's not just one note, but it's about internal conflict, and about conflict between people and their social conditions, and conflict between people and the society that surrounds them, which is often not always, but often a feudalistic society that pushes people towards violence, that pushes people towards addiction, that pushes people into war. And the imperatives of the society are part of what pushes on the conflict within the human heart itself of the characters that are trying to seek redemption or growth in these kind of actions. And it also depicts characters that aren't trying to grow, and characters that aren't trying to get better, and there are real people like that. And I think that it's okay that fantasy can depict characters like that without making them into cartoon villains. So just like in real life, many outcomes are uncertain. Grimdark also doesn't give you the certainty that the heroes or protagonists are going to succeed. Not everyone finishes their arc before they die. Redemption is not always irrevocable and final. People sometimes backslide into old bad habits, etc. And I think that just to bring up a couple of other grimdark series that deal with conflict within the human heart, that have humor, that have upbeat moments, that have levity, that have personal drama, and so on. Check out Joe Abercrombie's First Law series. Check out the Crimson Empire trilogy by Alex Marshall. Check out the Gentleman Bastard sequence by Scott Lynch, and The War for the Rose Throne by Peter McLean. And you'll notice that I mentioned Scott Lynch, and I think it's up in the air whether Scott Lynch counts as grimdark, and it's a hotly debated subject, so you can yell at me in the comments for including Scott Lynch on that list. I think that it at least has a grimdark setting, even if the characters are a moral contrast against that grimdark setting sometimes. And I just want to get into the question of, is grimdark always nihilism, and does it just and how it depicts graphic violence and sexual violence, especially when it's depicting war. Anna Smith Sparks wrote an article. She wrote Fires of Dust trilogy, and she wrote a article in Grimdark magazine that makes a really powerful argument that grimdark nihilism is both a provocation for readers to think about and take seriously the horrors of war and violence. And it's also, she claims, a hopeful scream into the dark abyss that many have to face every day in their war-torn world, and in the war-torn world we live in today. She says, I'm going to quote from her article, that Grimdark is the reality of pain, the knife blade cutting in, and the determination to go on, to keep on, to fight on. There are no heroes, no certainty. There's no bright, shining prophecy of light. Just messed up, selfish, wretched people trying to live their lives as best they can, trying to find something of love and happiness, trying to survive all the pain that life brings. One single moment of beauty, one single glimpse of something good, a tiny, perfect fragment of in a damaged life. Grimdark, and I think this is a beautiful quote, and I agree with Anna Smith Spark. Grimdark asks the reader, can men or women of violence, war, or power really hang on to an untarnished morality? You know, the enemies that people often face when they do violence in Grimdark, it's not like Aragorn, where most of your enemies are orcs and goblins and people that are already, by nature of their inherent essentialist evil nature, dehumanized. But instead, you know, instead of Aragorn's enemies, you get Logan Ninefinger's enemies, which are all real human beings that have families and hopes and dreams and wishes. And when Logan Ninefingers, from the Blade itself, that is, and from the First Law series, when he kills people, he ends all those hopes and dreams. And how do you think that carrying out that violence would affect the conflict within the human heart, would affect your morality? How can you depict a character like that without depicting the horrible spiritual and psychological damage that kind of violence would cause? And I'll quote again from Anna Smith Sparks' article. War is bad is hardly a radical statement outside of heroic fantasy, when war is so often shown as morally necessary and good, and without real consequence. If grimdark fantasy is particularly violent fantasy, getting down and dirty and blood-soaked and vicious, it's possible there's a reason for that. Killing the evil dude might be morally necessary, even in grimdark, but it still doesn't mean it's anything other than awful and likely to damage everyone involved, and grimdark goes out of its way to show that. So I want to move on a little bit and talk about briefly this accusation that grimdark is torture porn. And you hear that quite a bit, and I think it's an interesting accusation because one of the places that I've seen this accusation made and dealt with is that there is a blog post, I'll link it in the description, on Mark Lawrence's blog. He's a grimdark and fantasy author, and it is about a Guardian newspaper reviewer who reviewed Mark Lawrence's book Prince of Thorns and called it torture porn. And the interesting thing about that description is that there is not a torture scene in the Prince of Thorns. Torture is talked about briefly, but doesn't really appear on the page. And so I think that really shows that people hear or feel that something is grimdark, and they go in with a set of assumptions and preconceptions, and they just ascribe that onto what they're reading, and they fight the narrative, and they don't take in the message of the narrative, which is something completely different in a lot of cases than what they have brought with them to the table. You know, because obviously something that doesn't even depict torture one time is not torture porn. So when you read fantasy and fiction, one thing I've learned from Malazan and from this negative response to grimdark is that you can't fight the narrative. You have to read the narrative that's on the page in front of you. I think that grimdark is really a critique of the particular flaws of whatever society it happens to be depicting, or of particular aspects of that society, rather than a generalized stance on human nature. So I don't think that there's really anything that you can say about how grimdark depicts human nature in general. You have to look at how a specific grimdark novel or piece of fiction is depicting human nature and what it's saying about the way that the society that has been created in the fiction, which will often resemble real societies that do or have existed in human history, how those affect and pervert and distort and corrupt human nature. And I think that's an excellent transition to the next point I want to make. And that's that Grimdark often takes political economy very seriously. I've noticed in a lot of Grimdark work, from the First Law trilogy, from the War for the Rose Throne, from Mike Shackle's like We Are the Dead, the Poppy War, they all take political economy very seriously, and it has a huge impact on and is embedded in the narrative. Now, what do I mean by political economy? I asked two nerds how to define this concept, and they're two very different kinds of nerds. One's a railway worker working in a union who just happens to think about these things and study them in his spare time. And the other one is an academic and a political science major. They gave me two very different definitions for political economy, but I think they both show exactly what I mean when I say that Grimdark takes political economy seriously. The railway worker calls it concrete economics. Economics as it applies to everyday life in the real world, right here, right now. And the political science major says it's the view that the economic system is the foundation of social and political power. As a result, the economy cannot be analyzed without looking at its relationship to political power, while the political system must be understood in relation to its economic foundations. And I think that this is something that crops up in Grimdark a lot, and I can think of one really good example. It's the most minor of spoilers for Joe Abercrombie's book, A Little Hatred, and it's just the very beginning of our introduction to a character. So skip ahead a few seconds to the timestamp I'll put on the screen if you don't want to hear about this character from Joe Abercrombie's Little Hatred. But when we're introduced to this character, Broad, he's coming back from the war in another country to his farmland. And right as he's coming back and dealing with PTSD and dealing with the horrors that he went through and trying to return to normal, he finds out about what's known in British history as the enclosure of the Commons, where the lords who owned the land that was that the farmers worked on, and the lords who, sort of had power in British society, closed off the lands that the peasants were grazing their flocks on, and privatized them and made them, so that you couldn't graze on them, which forced these farmers and people who came from this agricultural background to move to the city to seek wage labor. And it was a way of using state power and property ownership to rob the people to create the modern working class. And he comes home, and the very day he comes home, the Lord's retainers show up with weapons to evict him from his property and to force him to sell his property to the Lord. And because of his PTSD and his experience in the war, he gets triggered by this situation, and he ends up fighting and killing them. This is the first scene with the character. And I think this really shows both this example of political economy being concrete economics as it applies to the everyday real world right here, right now, for that character in that time, and also the intimate connection of the changing economic system and the political system. And this is a common theme you'll find throughout Grimdark. And another example is, in a different Joe Abercrombie book, there's a redemption arc for a character, and I won't say who because of spoilers, but there's a redemption arc where the character finds redemption out in the wild with a fellowship of people. And then when he returns to the society that created the bad habits that he was trying to deal with in his redemption arc, the social pressures force him, despite his best wishes to the contrary and to be a better person, to to carry out the same kind of actions, that, although reluctantly, that he carried out before he found his epiphany out in the wilderness, away from society. So it shows the way that moral decision making is constrained significantly by power relations, by social relations, by the societies that we live in. We don't make decisions in a vacuum. Or, and I'll end on this point, as a totally non-controversial German guy with a big nappy beard once said, "Men make history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." And I think that concept is perfectly illustrated by a lot of Grimdark, especially Joe Abercrombie's work, Alex Marshall's work with the Crimson Empire trilogy, and Peter McLean's work with The War for the Rose Throne. And I'll just say, I'm going a little long here, so I'll just say I don't think that Grimdark is really just being edgy, except when it's poorly done or cartoonishly done. I think it has a lot to say about the human heart and human nature, and I will, and it does so in a way that's gritty and that deals with things that are grotesque and their implications and consequences very seriously. I'm gonna go now because I'm going a little long. Dark Portent signing off.